Flows of global capital, all these tend to suggest that we're heading in a backwards direction in terms of global trade. Has the department calculated the effect on Dubai's economy of an era of lower global trade growth?
You're very attentive to what I was saying. Fantastic. Since 2011, so let's forget the odd years of 2009-10, you know, world trade has been growing at half the rate of growth it has experienced before the 2009 crisis, 20 years before, right? So it was growing at anywhere between 5 to 6% per annum. Then post-crisis, it's been growing at 3%. This year, I tell you, it's 2.8% growth for world trade, and that is not good news. Now, there are those who, you know, the academic world is looking into the factors behind that slowdown in world trade. There are two main factors you can think of. One is what we call the cyclical factor. Growth rates in the world now, I don't know if you've seen the latest economic figures coming from the IMF yesterday. 3.1% growth in global demand, if you will, right? In the United States, growth is 1.6% forecast. The same for the European Union. So with aggregate demand being, you know, what it is, you'd expect world trade also to be done. Now, what is of interest to us, actually, is not the cyclical factors, but actually the structural factors that are leading to this. And let me name one of them, for example, right? What is happening in this policy environment? The WTO trade liberalization agenda has not produced anything to write home about since 2001, save maybe in the case of the trade facilitation agreement. So there is a lot there to be done on the policy front. At the same time, there are all these regional agreements that are being knitted together and that realign or will redirect world trade. There is the shock of the Brexit. All these are elements that make no mistake about it. We are following, and then, of course, we are trying, most importantly, not just, you know, recording what is happening there, but what remedial action can be taken now to try and, you know, soften the impact of a slowdown in world trade. So that's what it is. Until those structural elements, you know, the cyclical will happen. I mean, I cannot, you know, talk about promoting trade, you know, growth in the US or in the EU, but I can talk about, you know, the structural factors that are affecting world trade. So I'm being told to ping, right? So I'll thank you very much. You've been great listeners. I'll leave you in good hands. Rania, where is Rania? Oh, Rania. All right. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, Raed. I just want to remind everyone that towards the end of all the different speeches that we have, we'll do a quick panel. And if you've not had a chance to ask your question prior, you'll get a chance to ask towards the end. Right, I'd like to now call on stage Mr. Patrick Lowe, a visiting professor, University of Hong Kong, to give his speech. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to be here, and I want to thank in particular the Department of Economic Development for the invitation and for the hospitality. I'm going to talk about services. I'm going to focus my remarks really almost exclusively on services. It's something I've been studying for the last 3 years since I retired from the World Trade Organization, most of the time talking to firms about it in Southeast Asia and East Asia. I've learned a lot, and there's a lot more to learn. So the history of how we have thought about services and treated services is not a very service-friendly history. Back in the day when classical economics was at its height, there was a view that services had no value. The reason that services were supposed to have no value is because they couldn't be accumulated. And the creation of value was accumulation. And if you couldn't get something, hold it in your hands and drop it on your toe, it didn't have value. But then when you crushed your toe and went to see the doctor to see if he could fix it up, The doctor doesn't, I mean, he fixes your toe, but somehow he hasn't produced any services. So that was a little bit crazy. And I think the realization that this was not really, that services create revenue, they create jobs, they're part of the economy, was beginning to hit home. Then in the 60s, there was another mini crisis for services because there was an explosion of literature which basically said the problem with services is that they don't create any productivity. They're incapable of productivity growth. And so the bigger the services economy becomes, the bigger the trouble our economy is in. And this was a particular concern in the United States. Increasingly, it became realized, of course, it was realized that this was a myth, and services are a very significant, potentially very significant source of innovation. I think my colleague is going to speak about that shortly. The other thing that didn't do services much favor was the fact that they are very hard to observe and they're very hard to measure. Data is very poor. And the data that Raed was talking about, the value-added data, is still highly aggregated. We've still got a long way to go before we get a true handle on this. Services also tend to be customized. They're not standardized like many manufactured products. So that adds to measurement difficulties, and there's been a tendency to look at what's obvious under the street light and not look at what's in the underbrush. And so we've neglected data on services, and this is starting to be remedied. The reality, of course, is that services become more and more important in the economy. Today, they're worth 3/4 of GDP is services. Measuring trade in the right way, as Raed said, you end up getting a number of over half of trade is services. So if services are that important, we'd better understand them better. And my fundamental argument is we haven't paid enough attention to them historically, and we still have a lot of work to do. And that's also reflected in policy, which I'll say a bit more about. But there are factors on the demand side. For example, as people get richer, they spend more and more of their income on services. Services get more and more customized. On the supply side, internationalization of production, the increasing digitization of economic activity. All of these things add to the importance of services in the global economy. And so, whether we like it or not, services are going to become more and more important, and it's as well that we understand that and work with it. Another thing that is, another myth which has been shattered recently is the idea that services are not really tradable. The services economy was largely thought of as a non-traded economy until value-added trade came along and people realized that when you bundle any transaction involving two parties, arm's length transaction, is actually a bundle. It can be a bundle of services, it can be a bundle of goods and services, but it's a bundle of something. And within that bundle, if you bundle services in the right way, you can trade them, services that you couldn't trade if you think of supplying them by themselves. So I like very simple examples of things like this. So the person who cleans the factory floor in a factory that makes shoes that get exported is actually contributing to exports. Those cleaning services are being exported. They could not be exported if you tried to export them by themselves. So that's another really important thing. So bundling really matters, and bundling contains a lot of strategic considerations. Product differentiation, adding value. Services are crucial in that whole exercise. And then there's the question of innovation and productivity growth. Again, with a very simple example of the sorts of innovation which we think of as process innovation that you can get from services. UPS, not so long ago, the express carrier service, they had somebody who figured that in order to be more productive, more efficient, they should eliminate left-hand turns from their delivery routes of their trucks. Why? Because when you turn left, if you're driving on the right, you turn left, you have to wait for all the oncoming traffic. They figured that this was going to save them millions in aggregate, and indeed it did. That's process innovation. Well, that's, as I said, a very simple example, but there's all sorts of ways in which innovation can take place through the better use of services in production. And also there's the whole question of R&D proper involving goods. Services fit into that. They also are very much part of that. So for this work we did looking at value chains in Southeast Asia, some of the results were quite surprising. One was just how many services it takes to make up a global value chain. And it runs to dozens. Another really interesting finding was that for a lot of firms, services were the core source of value, even if they were heavily into trade. And even if they looked, on the face of it, very much like manufacturing activity. So we did a case in Japan of a company that produces large, heavy equipment, earth-moving equipment, bulldozers, cranes. And the CEO was really happy and proud of the fact that he was in the manufacturing sector, manufacturing serious stuff. And when we did the sums, and I suggested to him that actually he was a services company, he was not happy. But the fact is, more than 50% of his value was services. Now, in that particular case, it was largely because of post-sales services. That you make one of those machines, you have to maintain it for 30 years. That's big money, worth more than the machine itself. So these were some of the interesting things that we were able to get to by looking at, specifically focusing on the question, how do services enter value chains? Services are multi-purpose, they're multifunctional. Services lubricate value chains. Services also directly add value. But, as Raed was suggesting, services are like fugitive resources. Services can be added in many different locations, especially in a digital economy. So, if you want to keep them, you've got to make sure that you treat them nicely. And in my view, not enough governments take enough account of the need to treat services nicely in terms of policy. So, the other thing that we found, which I must say was a surprise to me, was how much lead firms outsource their services to third-party suppliers. Now, this is very significant because there were more than 60% on average of the 40 or so firms that we looked at, more than 50% were outsourced. And that's a very interesting question because if they're outsourced, it means that you're going to get real possibilities to be part of it, of the production of these services in the domestic economy. I've been told I must wind up, so let me just quickly finish with two things. One is the policy frame. One of the things that we found was that services generally get a much more raw deal in policy terms than goods do, than manufacturing does. Professional services, investment, the rights to hold equity, labor markets, all of these things, regulation is very intensive in services. So all of these things really make a difference in terms of whether or not you can use services effectively within your production systems. And I think that until that is rectified, there are disadvantages. I actually think that Dubai does rather well on this, but everyone can always do better. And when I think about the industrial policy objectives which I think are really interesting and important and very worthwhile, if you look at the sectors that are being considered for this, aerospace, maritime, aluminium, all of these are intimately linked with services. So I hope my pitch for services hasn't sounded a little too much over the top, but I really do think it's important and that it is a neglected issue. With that, I must stop. Thank you. I was told I have to stay up here just in case you have any questions, but if you don't, I'll go and sit down.
Thank you very much for this beautiful talk about services. I am Sid Ahmed bin Rawan, Professor of Innovation at Carson School of Management, University of Minnesota. It's not really a question, it's actually a comment that adds value to your talk. I think the reason of resistance to acknowledge the role of services is the ignorance in many ways about this importance of shift from industrial economy to knowledge economy. In a lot of countries, we see that policies and strategies are not really friendly, if you will, to this shift. And this shift, if it has to be recognized, it has to focus a lot on the human capital. And in a lot of regions, if you will, there is not that much of focus on human capital, because again, that's the basic of knowledge economy, and that's the basic of services. Thank you.
I would just absolutely agree with that. And something else I'd like to point out, certainly in the West, with austerity, guess what they cut? They cut the thing that doesn't create protests in the street, education, other social services. I think you're absolutely right. Human capital does tend to get neglected. But the other interesting thing about services, which I didn't mention, is that is a question of scale. If you want to make heavy machinery, there's massive economies of scale involved. If you want to do services, economies of scale very often are simply absent. A lot of it is just in here. And sunk costs are not necessarily huge. So again, huge opportunities there.
Thank you very much for that fantastic talk. I'm very much also in the services industry. I'm the CEO of the American Business Council. We're providing services to US companies and US industry here in Dubai in the Northern Emirates. We have roughly $25 billion in trade, in exports from the US to the UAE, and it's always a challenge to try to measure how much service is either included in that or on top of that. But my question is, services, yes, they can certainly be a value add, and they can bring fantastic growth to an economy, but they can be very dangerous as well. The .com bubble and burst is very much a services bubble and burst. I don't know if you would agree or not. I'd like to know your opinion on how governments and industry can protect against the negative aspects of the service industry.
Well, I don't think it's services qua services. What you're referring to, and I completely agree with you, is financial services. You're referring to the banking sector. You're referring to a world in which credit is created that is not backed by real assets. And the more you do that, the bigger the bubbles and the bigger the pop when they go off. But that's a problem in the financial sector. It's not a problem of services. That's kind of my immediate reaction to that.
The world is moving to more or less an online platform. Say a customer in Dubai orders a cloud service for $1 million dirham. The servers can be anywhere in the world. The support can come from anywhere in the world. Say for an iPhone, the value of the iPhone is not $100. The data that it contains, the thousands of, mobile apps that have been created. How do you quantify the trade of all this, cloud stuff and online stuff?
Excellent question, and the answer is depressing in the sense that if you want the information, you can't have it. If it's a transaction, like you order something online and it comes through in real form, like in a package or a parcel, you could start to get a handle on that, although in many jurisdictions, little packages don't get recorded. But were they, at least you could do it. But if you're just doing, an architect sitting in New York is designing a building in Dubai, and it's all going through the ether, unless they self-declare, you're not going to know. So there is a real problem, and we don't have an answer to that. You could say the credit card companies should become the tax collectors or the police, but you tell the credit card companies that and see what they say.
As the data indicates that the more the economies would develop and grow bigger, the content of service in total GDP would also grow bigger and bigger. Is there like a study that would indicate the optimum level of service in total GDP? In order, because one of the criticisms that we receive from time to time that our economy, Dubai, service content is really more than like 70–80% of total GDP. The manufacturing content and the actual production content is growing lesser and lesser. So what would be really the ultimate mix between the service and the real production, the manufacturing in a total GDP economy?
Short of planning the economy, I don't think you can declare you can identify an optimum. The fact is services will get bigger and bigger, but we're never going to get rid of manufacturing. Manufacturing is always going to take place somewhere. And I completely understand why Dubai wants to get into manufacturing. It diversifies the economy. A lot of R&D takes place in the context of manufacturing, even if there is a significant services component in it. And there's the whole question of skill sets, jobs. You know, the United States are trying to bring back manufacturing. The Indians have latterly decided that they shouldn't have tried to jump manufacturing quite as readily as they did. I don't think there's a simple answer, but it is true that for demand and supply reasons, services will become increasingly important. But at what point you get to the say, well, this is like an optimum, I think each economy will determine that, partly through what policies it uses, but also through the underlying conditions of supply and demand in that economy.
All right, we'll take one last question.
Thank you very, very much for this impressive lecture, and Dr. Raed, very impressive lecture too. Just a very quick comment on this. What I'm afraid of, that too much focusing on services, we are really undermining underestimating the contribution of the manufacturing component of the service. Previously, even the third world being at one phase being focused on go and do agriculture sector and be focused on the agriculture, and most of the third world really bypassing the manufacturing phase, and right now we are trying to focus on only services or service industry or service sector on certain countries in the world. I think we cannot really underestimate the manufacturing component of the value added for their own country, where they really can upgrade their skills and education and all other components. So I'm not sure what's your take on this. Thank you very much.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm trying to balance the balance sheet in the sense of dealing with the underestimation and underappreciation and relative lack of attention of services. Manufacturing is absolutely fundamental. And I also believe that manufacturing, for many economies, not all economies, but many, manufacturing is an absolutely fundamental part of the path to development. And I think if you take Singapore and Hong Kong, you get quite an interesting contrast. Singapore has been absolutely determined to stay in manufacturing. Hong Kong let it all shift over to the Pearl River Delta. If you talk to people in Hong Kong today, many of them think that too much of it shifted over and they should have kept more of it. Whereas in Singapore, they've made a conscious effort to keep high-end manufacturing. So I don't think we have a disagreement. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick. I'm pleased now to invite on stage Wykam Reiter, Deputy Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to give his speech. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. I hope this mic is working. This is an interesting format, and in the spirit of this format, I will try to touch upon a number of points. The way I see it is that we started from global value chains and the shifts in global trade. We went down to the services component, and I want to take a little bit follow up on what the professor said on the innovation part. Because broadly speaking, what Patrick referred to on research and development is, of course, a critical services component that you can apply across your sectors. The gentleman in the back who referred to manufacturing, and by the way, I'm Swedish. I come from a country that is very focused on manufacturing. But it has excelled in manufacturing through the services component. So I want to go from that broader picture of global value chains via services down to the question of innovation. As far as I understand, and I had the great pleasure of having my team review your Dubai 2021 strategy, this is a very impressive strategy, but basically what you're describing is a shift from a trade hub to a knowledge and innovation hub. And I think before I want to give my views on what that should involve, let me try to explain from my point of view, from a global perspective, why this is so critically important and why it's more important today than probably ever. And that goes to the heart of the question that Aid described. In a context of global value chains, or in the context of global interdependence, on the one hand, as a hub, you have a huge advantage. You have access to ideas, knowledge, technology and know-how on a scale that probably no other country has experienced in the past. And no, we haven't been in this situation where basically ideas and knowledge and technology is flowing and is readily accessible to all countries, provided they're able to exploit it. This is the benefit of being a hub, a trade hub, an investment hub, is that you know how to access these developments. But there are also a number of challenges, including being a trade hub. All of these factors of production are increasingly footloose. And the business model of a hub is, of course, to exploit the footlooseness of these factors of production, be it capital, goods, persons. Knowledge, in the sense of ideas floating, may be footloose, but knowledge in terms of an innovation strategy is it's a question of how do you embed what you can derive from others and turn it to something that you create yourself. It is an acquisition or adoption strategy turned into a creation strategy. Innovation in the end is to create ideas, not only consume the ideas that others have created. And this is a very, very difficult shift. And it's all the more important because in the world that we live in today, particularly in where you have every country on earth is not striving only to access global value chains, but actually to climb. So the competition in climbing global value chains is, I would argue, harsher than ever. You also have a number of developers like the mega regionals that actually change the competitive position of countries in their attempts to climbing value chains. But bottom line, value chains implies a business proposition to countries which can be very difficult to accept, which is no one can afford to be the weakest link. You will be linked. And the way to make money in value chains is to climb them. So that's where services comes in, and then ultimately that's where the question of how do you create the knowledge hub comes in. Now the way I see it is that technology, much more than any trade policy developments, be it mega regionals or the attempts of trying to wrap up protectionist measures, and I'll give you a very concrete example. George W. Bush had this idea that he would slap safeguards on steel. And I was a Swedish delegate at the time. We, of course, objected because we sold a lot of steel to the United States. It was a 30% tariff, would normally eliminate our competitive edge on the US market. We did not lose a single market share. In actual fact, the Swedish government and the Swedish companies involved gained market shares during George W. Bush protectionist measures. Why? Because we were niched. We had figured out how to create the value added. The bulk products were displaced on the market by local competitors, but the niche high-value stuff actually gained market shares. It's a perfect insurance policy against the volatility that intrusions by trade policy in global markets can imply. Technology is a major change that we're dealing with today. And I think one could not underestimate how much it will change. Fundamentally, the question of technology from a trade and global economy perspective is that it ultimately, in the end, determines who produces and trades, what do we produce and trade, and how do we produce and trade. So it's fundamentally very disruptive. Countries have to be agile and constantly adapt themselves to technology, much more, in my view, than what they usually overestimate the changes that trade policy could imply for their competitive position. Now, if you want to tap into technology, it's not a question of only absorbing the technology, but then how do you then create your own technology? How do you use the ideas that come with technology and then make it your own? And that, in my view, is the big question in the knowledge hub perspective. Now, innovation, I'm sorry to say this, I work on, for UN organization, we work a lot with academia on innovation issues. We run a big innovation program. But frankly, I have felt many times that this is a bit too academic. So I want to make this very basic. For me, think about football. Think about Barcelona Football Club.